President, thank you. I rise today as our federal government is on the verge of a government shutdown in the hope that both sides will come together and pass a resolution which not only keeps the government functioning but also fully funds our troops for the remainder of this fiscal year and enables our troops to be able to have the support that they deserve. It's not sensible, it's not practical, and it's not morally defensible to send our troops to fight for us in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now in Libya without giving them the resources they deserve. They shouldn't have to worry about their loved ones back home, whether they're going to be able to meet their rent payments, be able to make their mortgage payments, put food on the table even, while they are fighting for our country. I must tell you, I find it really extraordinary that our President, our Commander-in-Chief, has issued a veto threat on the troop funding bill that was passed in the House yesterday and is on the calendar here in the Senate today. Looking at the Statement of Administration Policy, which I have here, the President doesn't talk about concerns over the legislation, doesn't talk about concerns over the spending or the riders. He simply says this bill is a distraction from the real work that would bring us closer to a reasonable compromise. So I'm not quite sure what that means, except by not stating any objections to the legislation, other than saying it's a distraction. I think it's not responsible for our troops and our military. To be honest, I'm far less concerned that passing this bill will be a distraction to the United States Congress and to the President than I am concerned that not passing the bill will be a distraction to those troops who are putting their lives on the line for us overseas every day. As we all know here in this chamber, we shouldn't be having this discussion. We're talking about the funding for this fiscal year only because the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives last year didn't get their work done. In fact, for the first time since 1974, when the Budget Act was made law, the Congress did not pass a budget in either House. And that's why we're here, and that's why the continuing resolutions are necessary, these so-called short-term measures. It's too bad, because Congress not getting their work done last year means we have to clean up the mess this year when we should be focused on a much bigger issue. My colleague just talked about some of his concerns about the spending reductions that he talked about in H.R. 1. I would just remind us that not having gotten our work done last year, we are also facing the biggest deficit in the history of our country and a debt that is unprecedented, over $14 trillion. If we're truly worried about our kids and our grandkids and the next generation, we have to focus on that. But for today, Mr. President, what we're talking about is something very simple. It's just to pass a short-term measure to be able to keep government in operation and, again, to provide the funding for the troops. I would hope that we could do that today. We're talking about actually a relatively small part of that bigger problem I talked about. Even adding up all of the spending reductions in so-called H.R. 1, which is the most ambitious of any of the proposals out there, it's less than 2% of our federal budget, at a time, by the way, when our federal budget deficit is over 40%. So what we're debating today in the Senate and what is being negotiated behind closed doors here in the Congress and at the White House is such a small part of the issue. But here we are. So what do we do? What do we do to make things better and not make the mess worse? The short-term measure that the House has already passed yesterday is unfortunately the only thing we can agree on today, because given the process of this place, the House and the Senate, it's the only option we have to move things forward. We need to send it to the President while we're working on this longer-term legislation. And again, it does provide for our troops, which is incredibly important to us at this time with 3 wars and so much concern and anxiety out there among our military. This measure would reduce so-called non-defense discretionary budget authority by about $13 billion, again, while funding the military fully for the rest of the year. And by the way, many of these reductions were included in the President's budget. These are not particularly controversial changes. In terms of actual outlays, in other words, how much would be spent this year, it reduces spending by $3.9 billion. Now, in the context of our overall federal budget, that's 0.1%. So what we're talking about here today is 0.1% spending adjustment for the rest of this fiscal year. And yet we still can't seem to be able to get together to fund our troops and keep the government open. Some call that 0.1% extreme. We just heard some of that. I don't think it's extreme. I think it's only a first very small step we have to take, again, if we're truly concerned about the future for the next generation and concerned about our economy. Because if we don't get this record deficit and this debt that's growing out of control under control, it will continue to harm our economy today and our prospects for getting this economy back on track into the future. So I say, let's allow these negotiations to continue. In the meantime, let's fund our troops and let's avoid the disruption and the unnecessary disruption of a government shutdown. We can do that, Mr. President, and do that right now as a body by passing the legislation the House passed yesterday, send it to the President for his signature, and be able to take care of our fighting men and women for the rest of this year and keep the government from shutting down. Thank you, Mr. President.